am just curious about what's in it for Russia. I think you have played out in a couple of the things you've written, um, a Russian invasion, a couple thousand lives lost, which would be terrible on the Ukrainian side, maybe the Russian side, and then kind of they get their yayas out and they go home. But what is Russia doing this for? Is it for a better negotiating position, or is it just to kind of like muscle up and show that they have and want a regional sphere of influence?
Well, I think it's both. But I think the first thing to say is, look, isn't it a little bit unfair to expect Russia to be less paranoid than the United States? I mean, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day about China's negotiations with Equatorial Guinea in Central Africa about a possible Chinese base there.
Right.
And the Wall Street Journal said that America must oppose this by all means because Equatorial Guinea is in America's backyard. America's backyard, it seems, extends 6,500 miles from the United States. So, let's call the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, we know how ruthlessly America will act to exclude any hostile military alliance from Central America and the Caribbean. Now, America has had to accept qualifications to that, Cuba, Venezuela, just as Russia has had to accept NATO membership for the Baltic states. But as with America, there is a final red line which America will not tolerate, close to its borders.
Yeah.
Well, Russia is just the same. I mean, this isn't just Putin. The Russian establishment regards the idea of Ukraine being part of an anti-Russian alliance with absolute abhorrence, and in the end, is prepared to run, I think, to run tremendous risks and accept tremendous costs in order to prevent that. But I think, at the same time, they don't want to run those risks or costs if they can avoid it. So they're still using the threat of war to try to get the West to back off, at least to some degree.
To not allow NATO, to not allow Ukraine into NATO, which I know you've said is not actually going to happen. Just get, let's say, the anti-missile defense systems that NATO constantly points at Russia, to maybe turn those around, just spin them around. That's all they want. But yeah, I guess in terms of, I understand the whataboutism in terms of the United States asking that Russia not do this when we do the exact same thing in our hemisphere, in our sphere. But what does Russia actually want here? Are they, and what could they get? Because I know that some of the diplomacy is not that, there's not that much daylight in between where we could be and how this could all be solved diplomatically. Could you break some of that down?
I think what the Russian establishment hopes is to convince the Ukrainians that they never will, in fact, join the West in the sense of joining NATO and the European Union. And probably, by the way, that is actually true. But of course, for Ukraine, it's become, or the Ukrainian establishment, it's become a tremendous symbolic thing. And to give that up would, from their point of view, involve surrendering, a measure of Ukrainian sovereignty. But I think that the Russians feel that if you can really get the West to acknowledge publicly that this isn't going to happen, or perhaps the Russians would accept a moratorium. In other words, the West says we'll accept that for the next 20 years, Ukraine isn't going to be in NATO. Then the Russians hope that over time, the Ukrainians will somehow come back to the idea, well, we've got to have a decent relationship with Russia. Now, this doesn't mean annexing the whole of Ukraine, or I think actually even bringing Ukraine into a formal alliance with Russia, because they've realized since 2014 that trying to do that is going to create a revolution in Ukraine. But basically, just to keep open the possibility of a friendly, non-hostile Ukraine with Russia, which, by the way, from a Russian point of view, will also secure the role of the Russian language in Ukraine. There's a 20% ethnic Russian minority in Ukraine, and so will, in a certain sense, preserve a limited Russian sphere of influence. But this is a sphere of influence a little bit like the Monroe Doctrine. It's not trying to recreate the Soviet Union. I mean, Putin once said himself, he admitted, he's a Soviet nostalgist. So are not just a great many Russians, but a great many people throughout the former Soviet Union. But he said, anyone who does not regret the fall of the Soviet Union has no heart, but anyone who thinks it can be recreated has no brain.
Got it.
Putin actually said that, which I think pretty much says it all, really.
So regime change in Kiev, you don't see as necessarily the goal.
I don't see how they could do that unless they actually go to occupy Kiev. Now, I could be wrong. I don't have an implant in Putin's head, but I mean, from the Russian members of the Russian establishment I've talked to, I think they realized that they couldn't do that because they would face massive protests on the streets in Kiev and Western Ukraine. They'd end up having to shoot large numbers of people, the way they did in Czechoslovakia in 68 and Hungary in 56. I don't think they want to do that. I think they would probably try to take those bits of Ukraine where they at least hoped, perhaps wrongly, that they could get parts of the local population on their side. They certainly wouldn't achieve that in Kiev.
It's just a really weird way of going about trying to bring people to the table. I mean, it's working. Hell, we're all talking about Russia, but it does feel like if they do invade, and like I was saying, I didn't mean to downplay a couple thousand deaths. That'd be awful. But that it would only further entrench NATO's role in the region, and NATO, which I grew up listening to Chomsky, and all Chomsky says is how obsolete it is and pointing to it. And we can see all the ways that NATO-backed wars, which are really NATO-backed US wars, have been counterproductive, have created further instability in the last, 30 years, say. And it really is an obsolete military alliance that you can see now doesn't even really have the money or the backing because none of these European states are really committed to it, which they got other things on their mind. It's like Germany's selling a bunch of helmets or sending helmets to Ukraine. Like, cool, that's all you got. No one's really willing to stick their necks out. So why are we doing this? We just pulled out of a 20-year NATO war in Afghanistan. Yeah, big win there. I mean, Taliban is back in power. So it is funny to me that you're like, NATO's already on its back heels, Russia. Yeah, I feel like you don't need to do this.
Look, I completely agree with you. I think the Russians are wrong. I think this is a mistake. I think they would have been much better letting NATO quietly decay until indeed the Ukrainians became convinced that there was nothing really to hope for there. I mean, all I can say is two things. One is, as I say, security establishments are paranoid. God knows we know that from our own experience, right?
Yes.
But secondly, something I think the West has not paid nearly enough attention to is the fact that over the past year or so, the Ukrainian government and parliament have brought in some pretty tough measures, at least on paper, reducing the role of the Russian language in Ukraine. In theory, at least, abolishing it in higher education, abolishing it in officialdom, banning Russian TV and radio stations, even on paper, abolishing it from use in shops. Now, of course, across a large part of the country, this isn't going to happen because the vast majority of the population does speak Russian. But I think what it's convinced the Russian establishment of, perhaps wrongly, is that if this goes on for another generation, then this, these cultural bonds between many Ukrainians and many Russians, which Putin talked about in an essay last summer, will in fact be destroyed by Ukrainian state policy of ethnic Ukrainian nationalism. And so, in a sense, the Russians have to act now to put a stop to that. I have to say, I mean, quite why the West, which everywhere else opposes ethnic nationalism or says it does, somehow seems to endorse it whenever it's anti-Russian is an interesting question. But in any case, I think that is an important part of the Russian calculations. Now, of course, there too, they're probably completely wrong because, as has been remarked, and quite rightly, all these Russian threats, and of course the war in the Donbass since 2014, have actually turned a lot of Ukrainians who were previously more or less pro-Russian into anti-Russians. So, Russian policy could well be said to be failing, and an invasion would have precisely the opposite effects to what Russia hopes. But once again, if you like, we shouldn't be helping the Russians to make a disastrous mistake, because that mistake would be disastrous not just for them, but it would be disastrous for Ukraine. And of course, the economic consequences would be very bad for us as well. In fact, the only people, I think, who would be cheering this on would be China.
Let them fight. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do